The starting point, really, I mean, we always advise that people have 6-month probation periods. And certainly what we'd really want is that at 3 months, there's a sort of mini appraisal of how they've taken on the new role. And if there are areas of weakness, that something like a performance, review is put in place over, where you meet monthly, so that when you do get to the 6 months probation, you've given them the additional support and training, and maybe ironed out a few management issues that, it really is down to the firm, perhaps not enough resources, to ensure that they get to the point where they do pass, because obviously recruitment's expensive. There's a lot of time that has to be taken in training people. Much better that you use that first part to really get someone properly trained, enthusiastic, and able to do all of the different components of the job. So if you go to the first slide, Chris. So, what is an appraisal? So it's a two-way discussion, confirms, the main purpose of their job. Something that we do every year at the main appraisal is that we ask people to come with their job description and that they track any changes in it. Because if you don't do that, quite often people, particularly in admin, change what they do, and sometimes their job description no longer reflects what they're actually doing in the business. And you need that. If you're looking at redundancies, you really do need to know what people are doing. So in our business, and I would recommend this, we have a yearly appraisal, which is really a career chat, but then we have quarterly, 3-monthly catch-ups. And we have objectives, and what we try and do is we have short-term objectives every 3 months, that when we meet up again, they've done them, and we agree another 2 or 3 objectives, so that it's a dynamic process. It's not stale, it's reviewed. It might be just going on a training course, but then you want to check they have actually done that, or maybe found that wasn't the course they wanted, so they're going to go on a different course. And certainly with the main appraisal, you're planning the priorities and objectives for the year ahead. And I think it's really important that year appraisal is taken seriously, because I think everybody wants to know, firstly, that they're appreciated, but also if they have got aspirations, career aspirations, that there may be an opportunity for doing that. And certainly, particularly in law firms, we are expected with our solicitors to do continuing, courses and training. But I would say in any business, and certainly for our support staff, that applies to all of us. Next slide, Chris. So, in many businesses, we don't just have employees. We might have some people that are consultants or self-employed. Obviously, you do have to be really, careful about this whole thing about control. But certainly, if you have people sort of not so experienced, even if they are self-employed, it may be a good idea to include them. Certainly ours, it is just employees, and I think that's because once you start appraising and setting objectives and all that sort of thing, it is going against that whole principle that they're truly self-employed and able to manage themselves. So the main appraisal usually takes place annually, and you can have quarterly or 6-month reviews. I would really, really recommend a review, because quite often, if you don't do that, you just end up meeting yearly and nothing's changed. The course hasn't been booked, and it can be very stale. And of course, performance shouldn't just be dealt with through this process. If you have issues, they need to be dealt with straight away. You don't wait 3 or 6 months for an appraisal or a review. So, but certainly in terms of career planning and, I suppose, projects and objectives, this is the structure. So next slide. So the idea is that you're developing individuals, you're improving organisational performance, and what you are doing with people should feed into the business plan. Very much when we look at people's objectives, we have a column that says what business objective it's meeting. So I think sometimes you can end up with people that have a certain career trajectory, but actually it's not really fitting in with what your business wants. You don't really want to be training someone to go and leap onto another job. So it's always good to check that what they're doing is in line with your business planning. Next slide. So, I mean, these are just really old terms, but I think, you know, they're simple, you know, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. I like the objectives every 3 months because they can be very short-term ones that might be done, you know, in a couple of days. And we put the time scale that those people are meant to have done that. But, you know, it's a nice feeling going, yeah, I did that, that worked. Or actually, that's still ongoing. I've still got a lot more work to do with that. Or even reviewing something where an objective was set and it hasn't really worked for whatever reason, being time poor, or maybe the business focus has changed in the intervening period. So next slide. So these are the sorts of things that we have. I can let people have the slides afterwards, but some of these would be business purposes. We have things obviously around, you know, knowledge and skills in law. But, you know, they're just a selection. They're just, you know, ideas of what might be the business purpose for an objective. So next slide. And the aim is to create continuous performance improvement. I think that's what I mean. I think everyone likes to feel that they're sort of improving or having some new skills. And it's a chance for people to say, well, you know, have you got any objectives? Have you seen someone doing something that you'd really like to do as well? So next slide. So, you know, quite often when people come, we have their previous review. And in fact, our forms have the previous objectives to see if they've been carried out and done successfully. So they're reviewed, find out what the learning benefits were. And if they haven't been done, what the barriers have been. Job description, again, as I said, we review that yearly. And identify training and development needs. And then future potential, I mean, you know, in law, because we've got another law practice here, you know, it might be things like perhaps doing some training or some public speaking. And I suppose very much in teams, you're looking at people complementing each other. I'm a real believer that people are good at what, you know, people are good at what they like doing. So giving people this scope to say, oh, I really like doing that, I'd like some more training on it. You know, people are very, very different. So you quite often get people doing things and having responsibility for that in the team because they're very good at it and they like doing it. Whereas other people might not and might prefer to do something else. And that, I think, is a good way of working out where the work goes. And it's also good to talk to people about whether they have any ideas about improvements. Because our processes in particularly very regulated businesses can be quite cumbersome, and often the people working in there can have some very good ideas about how they could perhaps make it more efficient for us. Next slide.
Sorry.
So in terms of preparation, I think, you know, you do need to prepare, make sure that you've got, you know, the necessary documentation, and also, you know, if there have been a few issues, that you have a little bit of time to talk to the managers involved before you sit down. And, you know, make sure that you've got, you know, that time penciled out of your diary so that you're actually giving your full focus and concentration. There's nothing worse than going into an appraisal and being interrupted with phone calls or something like that. So next slide. So, you know, allocate enough time. I mean, again, with our forms, we ask people to look at what went well since they had their last appraisal, what they enjoyed, whether there's been any issues for them, and also other new projects they might like or objectives. So certainly that's done usually about 4 or 5 days before the appraisal. And then obviously you just need time to read it and review it before you go into the meeting with them. Next slide. So, yeah, I mean, if they've come with a tracked job description that's slightly changed, you can talk about that and perhaps remove, there might be some things that have been removed. Look at how the job's going and how this fits with the goals of the company, and look at what they've done well and what areas they'd like to improve. I mean, I think in our business, usually people's self-assessment of their skills and how they're doing is accurate. I think sometimes where it's worrying is if someone has a very different view of how they're doing than you do. So, next slide. So yeah, the environment, private, no interruptions, relaxed, comfortable. Next slide, Chris. So, you know, you will be asking them questions about what, you know, the employee thinks in terms of their performance and, you know, what's been successful. And yeah, you know, what you're looking at is, you know, agreed objectives for the future that, you know, certainly do fit in with the business. Next slide. So this is the one that everyone, you know, talks about in terms of how, you know, interviewing goes. I mean, whether it's an appraisal or a job interview, but so much of it's body language, questioning skills, listening, and feedback. So next slide. And this is what people say in terms of communication. It's 7% words, 38% tone of voice, and 55% body language, which always still surprises me. So, next slide. So, I mean, I think, you know, the appraisals, if you're able to do them quarterly or at least 6 monthly, they should be very fluid. Should be something that people look forward to, because it's an opportunity to talk about things they'd like to do. And I know, I mean, we didn't always do like this. We just had the yearly appraisal, and we've just learned that actually these job chats, they're not necessarily long. The appraisal, say, an hour, but the reviews are quite often only 15 minutes. But they're about continued good communication, really. So, I mean, now we're going into the sort of area of where, you know, there are issues with performance, and I'd certainly say in employment law that managing performance is one of the most difficult areas, because it requires a lot of consistency, and quite often you can be going down a process, it ends, and then have to go back to the drawing board again. So they're things that, you know, are ongoing. So capability is a fair reason for dismissal, and it's defined as relating to the skill, aptitude, health, physical or mental quality of the employee relevant to their position, including their qualifications. Next slide. So, in my opinion, I think where things often go wrong, and the cases that we get, are where disciplinary procedures are used around capability, which is why I'm a big fan of firms, organisations having a separate capability procedure. And I think, you know, you have to decide whether it is capability or misconduct. I mean, it can be a combination. You know, is it a can't do or won't do? And they do cross over, because sometimes, you know, people don't, on the whole, like change. A sort of an unwillingness to do things in a different way because they're asked to can become a misconduct issue if clearly they know how to do it, but they're choosing not to. But where it's entirely without fault, it's likely to be a capability issue. Yeah, and like I say, where they choose to do it in another way, that's more likely to be conduct. Chris, next slide. So these are grey areas. You know, producing the work by deadlines, is it because they're struggling, or is it because they just can't be bothered? missing money? Is it, they've chosen to take, or whether they've failed to understand a protocol or a procedure around handling money? And then failure to follow procedures can be, where they didn't really understand what was required of them, or maybe choosing not to do it that way because they just don't agree with their manager. And client complaints, is it about lack of knowledge or poor attitude? Next slide, Chris. So, I think the most important thing around performance is that you do gather evidence, and that the very first time that you meet someone, it is not accusatory, it's more inquisitive, and certainly along the lines of saying to somebody, look, actually there's been some concerns about your work, and then being very specific about, and giving an example, for example, and then saying, what do you have to say? Because quite often where there are issues, it may be a management problem, not an employee problem. It may be lack of training, lack of resources, and too much work to do in too little time. And you really want to listen and write down and document how they see that particular scenario, because it may be very, very different from their managers. And that's the thing about being balanced and fair. It is really important to listen to what someone has to say, and then go and investigate, go and check that out. So next slide, Chris. So, if it's decided, you go and investigate and decide, well, actually it's a bit of a two-way street, what you're then going to do is put them onto a performance improvement plan. And normally that's over a 3-month period, where you can have weekly meetings, but certainly on the monthly meetings, you have meetings to see whether the agreed targets and goals have been met. And in that period, what you might be doing as well is giving extra training, perhaps some mentoring. Certainly, this process will take between 6 months to 6 months, depending on the nature of the poor performance. But what you really want to be doing is removing the impediments, the barriers. So if someone says, well, look, I've never been shown how to do it properly, you're remedying that, so that, the next time it's like, well, we have shown you've had some recent training, which was, all encompassing, and yet you're still, not doing it in the way that we think you should be doing it, or not to the high enough standard. Next slide, please. And we have got a very long capability procedure if people would like that as well, which it's from PLC. But a dismissal is only fair where you've gone through several stages, and certainly you have the talk, you put into place measures. The first monthly meeting, if they've not been made, you can give a first written warning, and second, but quite often if it's done well, and certainly in the probationary period, what you would expect to do is to actually remedy the weaknesses and to make sure that they are a well-rounded employee. Some people just take more showing of how to do things than others, in certain areas. And certainly with a capability dismissal, you should also be looking at other alternative employment if they truly are in the wrong job for their skill set. That's difficult in most small organisations, but it may be entirely possible in a much larger organisation. And of course, training offered where possible. Next slide, Chris. So at the point that there might be warnings given, they are entitled to be accompanied by a work colleague or trade union rep. And it's just really important that all the way through there is a two-way street, that they're able to say how they're performing. And if it is a point where it's come to dismissal, then obviously they're invited to a meeting and you go through a normal disciplinary where they're they have the right to put their case and they have the right to appeal. I think the thing with a lot of these is that in most cases they don't end up going the whole way if there is a real problem, because quite often settlement agreements are entered into because the employee will say, look, I can't hack this anymore, is there an alternative? Or they might just resign and say they've had enough and that they want to go and get another job. So next slide, Chris. I do think it's good to do this regardless of whether anyone has a 2-year period, because I think it's fair, which is why I've introduced the fact that, if you've got a 6-month probationary period, that if there's weaknesses, you should be doing it 3 months into the contract. But also, quite often when you do have the chat, there may be things that come out that there's a hidden disability, like dyslexia or depression. And then there will be a requirement to make reasonable adjustments, and that person does have rights if they come under the Equality Act's definition of disability. So, in my opinion, it's, we've all got protected characteristics. We're all, one sex or the other, a young or old or whatever. So much better to carry out fair processes right from the very beginning than to get hung up on, well, people only have rights after 2 years to bring a claim for unfair dismissal, which, although that's true, they certainly have a right even before the employment relationship begins to bring a discrimination claim. For example, if you've got a disability and you're not shortlisted, you would have a potential claim against a potential employer. So, and also there's quite a few exceptions as well to this 2-year rule. There's automatic unfair reasons for dismissal. And I think I've put a huge list, there's loads of them. So just good practice means your business isn't at risk, but also you're giving someone the benefit of the doubt and keeping them in the business if they've perhaps had a bit of a blip. Sickness and absence by reasons of sickness can be a capability issue, but then you do need to look at an ill health capability process, which is also in this long policy that I've got. Chris, next one. So, if they have got health problems and are likely to be disabled, then you have to make adjustments to processes as well. So, for example, that might mean that your performance improvement plan is longer than it would normally be, and that you would say as adjustment, it's not going to be 3 months, it's going to be 4 to 6 months long. So definitions of disability, it's a physical or mental impairment which has a long term, so that's has lasted more than a year or is likely to last more than a year, and has a substantially adverse effect on the person's day-to-day activities. So, I mean, it's also, in terms of knowledge, it's ought to have known, if someone's been off with depression, and then when you do a back to work interview, you find out they're taking medication for their depression. The reality is that, probably they are likely to suffer from depression for more than a year, because people tend to go on medication, certainly for a year or more, for stability. And therefore you do need to be looking at adjustments. And if you don't make reasonable adjustments, that that is a head of claim for disability discrimination. And if they're saying, well, actually it's to do with my disability, I'm dyslexic, I actually need more time to do this, then you would need to make reasonable adjustments. And reasonable depends on the size and resources of the company. The bigger and the richer the company, the more you're expected to do than a very small business. So next slide. So issues post-lockdown, a lot of the ones that we're coming across really is that obviously people have been asking to do hybrid working and to do half and half, and some not even come back at all. But some, I mean, it's a lot to do with the sort of ethos, I suppose. Some businesses have liked home working, some haven't. But where it has impacted on someone's productivity, that may be a reason for them resisting, you know, them making a flexible working application. But certainly I don't see why all the things that you do when people work in the office can't be done, particularly with so much technology where we measure how much time people are spending on things. And, you know, obviously we're having this training through Zoom. You know, prior to the pandemic, this training would be in my office, and many of the wonderful people that are all over the country wouldn't be able to attend. So, you know, there's pros and cons, but, you know, I think maybe you're just sort of managing capability in different ways if you're not having day-to-day contact in the office. But certainly it can be a reason for refusing continuing home working if you can clearly show the difference. But I think, I mean, the things about home working, that's really about trust. We always say that with flexible working, people earn the right to flexible working. It's not a given. And certainly there are people that you know that work just as hard at home because, you know, they're committed to clients or customers, and that's the way they are. And maybe other people that we think might not be able to manage their time as well and do so much. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you all the examples of unfair dismissals that don't require 2 years service. You know, whistleblowing, someone making complaints about health and safety. So I think it's just easier just to be fair in a blanket way than all the time be thinking, well, you know, we don't have to do this because. So next slide, I think it's a whole slide. Yeah, so there are other examples of where you don't need 2 years. So next slide. So common problems is that people go off work and just put in doctor's notes. I mean, that's only really a problem where I suppose people are on full pay. You know, if you've got someone on 6 months full pay, that's pretty annoying. And also, if people think that they've been unfairly managed around capability, they can grieve. Where we deal with a lot of employee work where people come to us and say they're being unfairly performanced out of businesses or offered settlement agreements with not very much money in them. And the first thing I always say is, when did your manager change? Because certainly if that person's been in an organisation for 20 years and they've been fine, either they haven't been managed properly or a new manager's come in who's actually a different personality from them or their previous manager. And that can often, you know, cause a lot of problems. Always think, even with people that don't necessarily come under the definition of a disability, consider adjusting the processes, you know, neutral venues, allowing a friend or family member to accompany. You want people to engage, not to go off sick. And also, if you've done it right from the beginning, where you've, you know, it's very open questions, look, this has come to my attention, what do you think? You might have made a decision right at the very beginning that actually it's a management issue, it's not their issue, it's one of lack of resources and training. So, you know, this prevents, you know, people having a really terrible reaction to being performance managed. It should really be seen as something that's in everyone's interest, and it's about extra support. Next slide. So, you know, issues that, is it possible to dismiss for a single act? I mean, yes, if it was, you know, gross negligence or very, very serious. But I think where we usually have problems around sort of capability is where there's been lots of things that have gone wrong. So by the time you talk to them, it's been going on for ages, and then you're giving them a huge list. Really, we talk about, when managing people, that you have difficult conversations almost immediately after things happen, whether that's conduct or capability, so that usually you're only dealing with one thing. so that it's usually a lot more measured. When lots of other things are on top of that, it tends to sort of, you know, become a lot bigger, particularly if it's lots of low-level stuff. And yes, a final written warning can be given for a first incident if it, you know, if it had you lost clients from it, or they did something really, really negligent or reckless. And then the use of settlement agreements, you know, I've done blogs on this. I mean, it's always much safer if you start to go through a fair process and actually place them on a performance review. If they then say, oh, look, I really don't want to do this, is there any other way that, you know, forward? That means, you know, that then you can say, well, you know, I can take some legal advice, or I can go and talk to my head of team. And then you can say, well, look, you know, the performance review would have taken 3 months. We're prepared to pay you another month's money in your notice period, because even when you dismiss, if someone is dismissed on, you're always going to be paying their notice period. You dismiss on notice unless it's gross negligence. Next slide. That's it, really. I mean, we have got our capability procedure. We could do some questions, but we could actually put, I'm really happy to send you our policy, because I think it is a really good policy for guiding HR people. But before we do that, are there any questions about sort of scenarios? Or
if you were to offer somebody, if they weren't working well in their position, and you offer them alternative position within the company, have you got to keep to their salary scale that they're on at the present time?
No, I mean, I think you've got, I mean, the problem is where people have been over promoted, I think, and then you're sort of trying to persuade them to go back to their former job. I think most people would probably rather move on, because they might find it, you know, quite hard in terms of reputation. But no, I mean, but you've got to make it palatable. I mean, I would say there's nothing worse than someone being in the wrong job. And, you know, if you've recruited someone externally and then just not right, it is much better letting them go in the first 6 months, because it's soul destroying. Perhaps with someone that's been over promoted, you know, I think you do need to perhaps look at more training, more support before offering an alternative job. But no, it doesn't have to be. But then, you know, if they've had a £4,000 or £5,000 pay rise and you're going to demote them again, you know, if you're in a bigger organisation, you can sometimes be creative, and particularly if you like the person, they've got some very good skills, but they're lacking in a certain area, then you might want to sort of create a new role and bring someone else in, but you've got to have the resources to do that. So any other questions? Chris, do you want to just put our policy on the system, because we can just show you something that a lot of lawyers use something called Practical Law Company. It's routers, and there's long policies and there's short ones, but the long ones are often quite useful because they really take you through what you have to do. So this is called the long capability procedure. So if you just scroll down, Chris, to, you know, what the aims are, it's to give a framework. And why it's very good is it just gives you, you know, where it does apply and where it doesn't. Quite often we could have people coming to us who are supposedly on capability procedures, but actually the whole terminology is about disciplinaries, because their capability, and they've been told they're going to a meeting to be disciplined. And that's where it does start to go wrong, because it's sort of mixing up a conduct process with a capability process. So, I mean, this is quite good. It says that normally you should identify issues and have an informal chat where you look at the required standards and the reasons and causes. So that's what I say about that open-ended, you know, inquisitive, not making any decisions yet conversation. Next page. You know, set targets. There's a section on disabilities, yes, because, you know, obviously if someone says, well, actually, I've been extremely depressed recently and the whole reason I haven't been performing, then what you really want to do is to put in some support for them and make adjustments, so perhaps a longer process. And also, if confidence is involved, you know, perhaps doing some things where they're really gaining confidence. I think that's really important. It should be confidential. You know, really it's between the person and their managers, and you don't really want other people to know about it. And then if you decide that you are going to take formal action, then, you know, you'll need to be very specific about what targets they have met and what they haven't done and what the likely penalty is. So next page. So I mean, I know you're using those meetings just to be fair and to say this is the issue, and the person be able to give themselves time to respond. If it does involve warnings, they've got the right to be accompanied by work colleague or trade union. But again, you know, you might want to make adjustments regardless of whether you're actually totally sure it's a disability. But just because it helps get the process through without that person going off sick. Next, keep going. Yeah, you know, if someone can't make the first time, give them an alternative time. Other adjustments can be doing it on Zoom, you know, from their home rather than doing it face to face. That can be less daunting, and also much easier if they do want someone from their family, their partner perhaps, to be with them. Next one. And I mean, quite often what happens is that people are making improvements month to month, so that it doesn't come to warnings, and that, you know, you remove some of the objectives as they get there. I suppose the thing is that's really annoying is that there are people that do the bare minimum, and probably there is a bit of conduct there, and you go through a whole performance review, and because you've got your foot on the accelerator, they perk up, you know, and they do as they're told, and then as soon as you stop, you know, within a few months it's back to how it was. But I think maybe that if that keeps happening, you maybe be looking at it as a conduct issue, because you know that they can step up, but only when someone's got, you know, looking over their shoulder and making sure that they're doing it. You know, I know that managers really struggle with that with certain people. If you go down, yeah, so first warning or improvement notice, you know, say if it's a 3 month in the first monthly meeting, and you might have had weekly one-to-ones. Keep going down. You know, obviously targets for improvement need to be, you know, they need to be fair and agreed. And then you might get right up to final written warning, and I think that's usually where people are thinking, oh look, this just really isn't working out, is there another solution? And quite often they do end up with settlement agreements. Keep going. And of course, at each point they do have the right to appeal if they don't agree with the sanction given. Keep going up, Chris. And then the final one, you're looking at dismissal or redeployment if there's another job. Yeah, it is quite good in contracts to have that right to demote, a contractual right, so it's not seen to be a breach. And dismissal is with full notice pay, and they will have the right to appeal. Further down, Chris, a bit more. And then there's a bit about how the appeal hearing will be heard by someone else independent. Keep going. And at the appeal, they can confirm the original decision, revoke, or substitute a different penalty. So that's where it is really looking like a disciplinary. I think it's the bit that goes before that that's different and is about training and support and listening and and making sure it isn't a management issue before you go down this disciplinary process.